here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and I come again to you. Verse number 5 again says, and Abraham said unto his young men, abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. I want to talk for a few minutes using the title, The Sacrifice of Sincere Worship. The sacrifice of sincere worship. Verse number 5 again, if you allow me to bother your attention. It says, and Abraham said unto his young men, abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. The sacrifice of sincere worship. Worship is not cheap. Worship is very costly. So what does it cost us to worship God? The sacrifice of sincere worship. Genesis chapter 22 opens by letting us know something that Abraham does not yet know. That is, God is testing him. When we glance into the windows of the life of Abraham, we see him undergoing many tests. In chapter 12 of Genesis, we meet him as he endures the forsaking test, by which God commands him to leave his region, his relatives, and his religion, in order that God would bless him, and in turn, he become a blessing to the entire world. After being obedient to the will of God and relocates his family from the confines of a pagan society, God faces a famine test shortly after arriving in the land of Canaan. When he arrives in Egypt, he's challenged with the falsehood test. When he confesses Sarah to be his sister instead of her being his wife. These tests were followed by the fellowship, the first choice, and the forgiveness test. Notice when he separates himself from his greedy nephew Lot. Then after separating himself from his greedy nephew Lot, he gives him first choice in land. Then he forgives him, and he goes back and he rescues him from the enemy's armies. Abraham is a man who understands test. And let us not forget the faith test, as he believes God about having a son in his old age. After believing God, he's declared to be righteous. Abraham is a man who understands the testing of God. Abraham encounters test after test. But in chapter number 22 of the book of Genesis, Abraham is greeted unknowingly with the greatest test of all, the foremost test. This is known as the foremost test because it challenges his faith in God, his obedience to God, and it sets the stage by which we see the worship of God at its best. Genesis chapter number 22 falls within the confines of the law of first mention, which simply suggests that anytime you see a doctrine, a theme, or a word for the first time in the Bible, the passage can be understood to set the tone for the understanding throughout the Bible. The first mention of the word worship, we notice it here in Genesis chapter 22. Verse number 5, as Abraham says to his young men, abide here with the ass, while the young men about here with the ass, while I and this young boy will go yonder to worship. To the diligent student, the Bible is amazing with its consistency. That is, God has created us to worship. It teaches us of a God who's all-knowing, who's ever-present, all-powerful, and in his uncreated nature is self-sufficient and possesses no lack whatsoever. Yet he looks to man who he has created to worship him. This represents a spiritual oxymoron, which suggests that the Creator actually seeks the creation for something, that is, the worship of God. God's supreme purpose in making man was not for him to ride Bentley coupes or wear a money suits. It's not for him to become puffed up in pride and glow in the rays of his own self-sufficiency. Nor was God's purpose in creating man tailored to fit our own ideologies about obtaining certain socioeconomic status or fraternal orders. God's supreme purpose of making man was to worship him. God's purpose for making man was to have somebody capable and properly and sufficiently to be able to worship him, thereby satisfying his heart. We were made to satisfy the heart of God. Worship in its truest form is giving back to God what he deserves. The question then becomes, what can we offer God? What can we offer God, who is self-sufficient and is not in need of anything? What can we offer? What can we offer as men and women here in 2012? What can we offer a God who's in need of nothing? The psalmist says, what is man that God is mindful of him? Or the son of man that God even visited him? What can we offer God who's in need of nothing? Psalms 24 says, the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. What can we offer a God who stood on the banks of nothing, looked across the sea of anything, and made everything? What can we offer God? The question then becomes, what can we offer a God who's self-sufficient and in need of nothing? We can give God, I'm glad you asked, we can give God what he has first given us. We can give God our lives. God is looking for us to give him back the very thing that he has given to us. That is our life. God wants us to present ourselves to him as instruments of worship in order that we may gain the right perspective on life. In order that we may gain the right perspective on life. We must first be willing to present our bodies a living sacrifice unto God, who is our what? Reasonable service. God then becomes pleased with our worship when we are willing to give him back the most prized possession in the world. The text suggests that in order to sincerely worship God, we must be willing to sacrifice our entire lives for the kingdom. In order that we should worship him, we should first of all, recognize that God has spoken. The text says, and it came to pass after these things that God did test or tempt Abraham